Hello, and welcome back to our third panel. In this panel, we'll be looking a little bit future facing to try and predict a little bit about the use of artificial intelligence in law in the near term, 5 years out. And I know that we said we would be grounded in the evidence, and I intend to be in this panel as well. And I think let's talk a little bit about some principles that I believe make for good, more reliable predictions about the future versus principles for making less accurate predictions about the future with respect to technology. What out there are folks in the world who are making predictions about the future of artificial intelligence generally or artificial intelligence in the law. But I think I would advise our audience to be skeptical of predictions that have two features. One are features that predictions that occur more than 5 years out in the time frame. It's quite hard in general to predict technology 5 years out, even harder to pick beyond the 5 year time frame. So an example I will give of what I think is sort of an unreliable prediction framework are those who follow the singularity model of prediction. That was a mode of prediction made 30 years out about various futures of artificial intelligence. Another example of how the singularity, I think, is an example of bad predictive capabilities in the space of AI is that it relies on technologies that have yet to be invented. So if you see people out there predicting in the space of artificial intelligence based upon things that still have yet to be invented, such as strong artificial intelligence or analytical reasoning. That is a principle of skepticism because it's very hard to predict if and when technologies that have not been developed, when and if they will be. By contrast, I think there are some fairly reliable methodologies to see the near-term future, and that's what we're going to be working on in this space. I think if you restrict your time frame to the 1 to 5 year time frame based upon technologies that exist currently, you can often make reasonable predictions that certain of today's technologies will become faster, cheaper, more expansive, etc. And while that's still fraught with issues, we can, I think, make at least better predictions by putting those constraints on reality. And so that's what we hope to do in this panel. So joining me are really excellent and distinguished set of panelists. From the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, we have Kevin Ashley. So Kevin Ashley is notable because he's one of the real pioneers in artificial intelligence and law. He has a long and distinguished history of doing real hands-on computer science work in legal argumentation, all sorts of other areas of artificial intelligence in law. So very honored to have him here. Also joining me is another pioneer in artificial intelligence and law is Ansel Halliburton. So Ansel is involved in the early days at Stanford of legal informatics and many of the projects that have spun out there in the world in predictive analytics in its early phases. And last but definitely not least is Megan Ma. Megan Ma is kind of the future of legal informatics. She's upcoming PhD recipient and going to be a fellow at the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, the CodeX Center. So I'm really pleased to have all of you here joining me as we peer cautiously into the future of artificial intelligence and law. So let me ask my first question to Megan, and then I will toss it out to the rest of the panel for reactions. Where do you see the most promising developments in the use of artificial intelligence within law, looking at the near-term 5 year time frame?
Yeah, thanks so much, Harry. And I'm so happy to be here, and especially amongst giants. I frequently refer to Harry, your work, and of course, Kevin, your work kind of, both of those, a lot of your seminal pieces really ground my thesis. So I'm just really thrilled to be here. So to your question, I think that what's most exciting and what's most promising about AI in the use of AI in law is actually kind of in how it may be able to reveal the legal information that is being contained in our texts. I think at the moment we have these assumptions or these strong intuitions, and we rely a lot on experience, the experience of law. But now we're actually able to test some of that. We see that on both sides, whether we're part of the camp of computational law and the rules-based side and knowledge representation, or we're on more of the data-driven side and looking into the neural networks. We're kind of able to really unpack what's contained before in natural language, how the law kind of has been captured and manifests itself in natural language. We're actually able to find that out, at least from the computational side. As we try to build models on this text, we see actually the law is rather networked. How far back can we code or codify the law? So I think, again, what's most promising is information that has been contained in these texts and in legal texts. We're now actually able to see it. A lot of scholars, kind of the emerging field of experimental jurisprudence. We see Julian Nyarko, for example, or Kevin Tobiah, who's experimenting with what actually is ordinary meaning and ordinary language in law. So this is all, I think, what is most promising and what's exciting and what's to come.
That's great. And Kevin, do you have any reactions? Where do you see promise or reaction to what Megan said? Either one.
Thanks, Harry, and thanks for the invitation to participate. It's a pleasure to be here with Megan and Ansel. And I really do agree with what Megan has said. There are sort of two particular areas that I would focus on. First is improvements in automated contract review for purposes of due diligence. And secondly, in the use of legal text analytics to improve access to legal materials by members of the public, as well as legal professionals. In the former category, I'm very interested in the work of Nick Long at Gravity Stack, who predicts that these improvements will amplify the utility of virtual data rooms and make it possible for lawyers to understand better what's there in these enormous data repositories of contracts associated with due diligence searches, that in the next 2 years, he predicts AI will generate reports that help to reduce the initial legwork on the part of the attorneys and focus them more quickly on the problems and the risks. And in the area of making legal texts available to the public, I'm working on helping users find sentences that explain statutory terms in cases and that can summarize the cases in terms that will help the users decide if the case is worth following up.
And just to follow up, Kevin, where do you foresee contract diligence improvements happening?
Where, Harry, or which particular ones?
Yeah, what sort of developments do you see forthcoming in improvements?
Well, I think that the improvements will be in the area of helping the systems to take advantage of the output of the human reviewers of the contracts. So the human attorneys are using the virtual data rooms. They are making notes as they go. And so far, at least, as far as I know, the systems are not able to process the notes and those annotations and make them available more generally to other users. But that's an area where I think as the data gets collected, work can be done to actually help to translate those notes into a form that the system can understand and use to help privilege the presentation of certain materials over others.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And let me turn to Ansel, who I also should mention is also counsel at Align Technologies focused on IP matters. So, so Ansel, where do you see the most promising developments in AI in the near term in law?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Thanks for inviting me. It's pretty fun to be here. So I agree with everything Megan said and most of what Kevin said. I think documents are really where the action is likely to be for the foreseeable future. That's something I've been working on for quite a while as well, before I came to Line 2 years ago. I was working on a startup doing document analytics that we had spun out from Airbus's R&D lab in Silicon Valley. So it's definitely something I've been focused on for a very long time. And there's so much more work to be done understanding documents and bringing structured data out of unstructured text documents. And law is really just one area where that's true. When we were at Airbus, we had done a little mini pilot with a life sciences company understanding cancer trial research papers, and it's really the same exact problem. So I'm excited about not just legal specific tools, but just the state of the art generally improving to extract structured data out of documents. I think there's a lot of small applications.
Ansel, can I just pause you there for a second? Just for our audience, do you want to explain what the difference is, what's an unstructured document and what's a structured document, just so in the context of a contract, say?
Yeah, so if you and I as humans look at a contract, we see a rectangular piece of paper. It has probably a title. We can very easily visually hone in on that title, and then we see some bullet points or numbered sections with some spacing between them, and we can see that structure just very intuitively. Much harder for machines to do that, it turns out. And so one thing that we had been working on at the startup was inducing the logical structure of that document just from basically pictures of paper, PDFs that were maybe scanned in from paper, that kind of thing. So a lot of exciting improvements over the last few years in that area, and you can learn a lot more from the document once you understand its structure. In terms of structured data, what I mean by that is things that you can plot on a graph. You can put them on a map, right? You can't just sort of, what a lot of the due diligence tools from M&A do is they will identify sections of a document that might be about a topic, and that's great. But you can't really do much more computation on them than that. But if you can pull out prices or dates or things like that, then you can actually do more interesting computational operations on them.
Great. And you were going to make another point before I distracted you about where you see points of the future going on.
Yeah, I think there's little things like from where I sit in in-house practice, it's different than when I was sort of practicing in a firm where we're just part of the business. And so I read and write a lot of email and file a lot of email. And so one little feature that I've seen recently demonstrated is predictive filing, which is not a very sexy, exciting feature, but it saves you a couple seconds each time you use it. And you use it maybe 50 times a day and use that 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year. That stuff adds up. So real productivity savings.
Any reactions to Ansel's comments from either Megan or Kevin?
No, but I'm curious what Ansel disagrees with that I said before.
Nothing in particular. I think just more the focus is, I think my focus is less on the sort of big M&A transactions. I think in-house and outside counsel M&A people will be fine. They can afford to throw more resources at these problems. And so I think they're academically and technologically very interesting, but it's a bit of a so what for me. I think there's a lot of room for this kind of technology to help with access to justice problems. We can analyze briefs now. There's a number of tools on the market that do that. And once those sort of come down in price and become affordable to the general public, that's going to help people a lot.
Okay, so this has been a theme of a lot of these panels, which are a lot of these tools are being used in areas of law that have sort of limited social impact, but there's a lot of opportunity for these tools to be used in ways that really help society and unlock a lot of social justice values, and that's something really to be aware of. So Ansel, just as a follow-up, you talked about, predictive filing, and what I take by that, you mean, documents are coming in instead of an attorney figuring out which folder or which matter to assign it to, the computer can make an educated guess. So do you, are you, in your own practice, do you find AI doing more incremental improvements like this or more substantial improvements or some combination of the both?
Think there's a ton of room for incremental improvements, little things like that that are not going to get a lot of headlines, but they'll be working away in the background, making people's lives a little bit easier every day. And the upside of that is really it frees you up to do the more value-added work that practicing at the top of your license, as people in legal ops like to say, the really value-added stuff.
So peering a couple years out, where do you see just incremental improvements in predictive analytics, things like that, that could actually make a big impact on day-to-day practice?
Yeah, so things like making documents more searchable is one that maybe people don't think about as much. Pulling that structured data out of documents, like for example, in-house, we have a big heavy-duty contract lifecycle management system, and it's a lot of work plugging in manually all this metadata that goes with each contract record. Well, wouldn't it be better if a computer could do some of that, scan the contract and extract, at least most of that stuff? And there's tools on the market that do that already, but they're not widely deployed yet. So I think that's one example of incremental but helpful improvements that I think are going to play out over the next 5 years.
So some opportunities for just simply applying technologies that are out there today in areas of legal practice that are very manual, where we could really improve things. Megan and Kevin, do either of you have any reactions to this idea of incremental improvements in AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to echo what Ansel was saying. I think that actually a lot of the change is both incremental and substantial in the sense that I think the biggest types or most substantive changes are going to come in an incremental way, because I think change that really makes an impact, most people are not actually actively conscious of it. What I mean by that is, if you imagine in legal research engines at the moment right now, those who are kind of starting up in law and trying to engage with these systems, many of us have probably experienced the whole trial and error process around it. The keyword search, as Pablo Arredondo says, it's the prison of keyword search. And what we kind of notice right now is many people eventually have to go through a steep learning curve to master these tools. And then these new legal tech tools that are super incredible, they come on stage, but there's a fatigue, and that's actually probably the inertia behind their pickup. And so what I imagine actually is the available option of both, to kind of see the difference, and for user interfaces to be much more accessible, because at the end of the day, people don't want to learn new tools and new methods of mastering it. They kind of want to seamlessly transition into it. So I think that's probably one way that I see how it's both incremental and substantial.
Megan, that's a great point. And I like to say one of the most successful AI tools of all time that everybody takes for granted is a little red squiggly line that you see in Microsoft Word that tells you when you've spelled a word wrong. It's operating in the background using a lot of sophistication, but it blends in so seamlessly we don't even see it there and we just take it for granted. So that's a great point. Kevin, do you have any thoughts about this?
Harry, I think incremental change is likely because as these tools get used, they collect new kinds of data from the ways in which the users employ the tools. Just to follow up on my little example of learning from human annotations of the contracts, you can't make progress on that unless that data is available. And when they're using the tools, they're probably, if the tool is well designed, using it in a way where they're recording their data at various points. And then that means there's a new collection of data with which to make some kind of improvement. So I see this as an incremental process.
So kind of this positive feedback loop of improving the learning data that we're seeing in a lot of areas. How, for instance, your email program learns how to better identify spam the more you train it and the more you teach it.
Yes. Yeah. And there's both the learning from the human usage in terms of learning weights that allow better prediction, but there's also just learning from new kinds of information that people are recording. They have an opportunity to make linkages between documents. Megan pointed to this before, and perhaps to annotate the significance of it. And if you get that data, you can start to figure out, can it be analyzed intelligently, or can we use some kinds of techniques to get humans to kind of make their comments more stereotypical so that a program can reason with them and do something interesting with them.
Right. So this is sort of leveraging semantics and knowledge representation on top of some of these other to make better use of this information.
Ideally, yes.
Megan, did you want to react to that?
Well, I think that what's kind of fascinating at this moment is really, and someone had raised this as a question in the Q&A about if we make kind of these documents more structured and we kind of establish more of a framework around it, are we removing the context? Are we getting rid of the nuance? And I think that what's interesting and why kind of there should be a partnership between kind of more the data-driven approaches and getting better data, as well as the knowledge representation side, is we're able to start reframing how we can capture context and can capture nuance. I think one of the biggest hurdles we suffer from is the intentional versus unintentional ambiguity. And there's a lot about how we can structure better to get rid of the unintentional ambiguity, but is that in a way removing the intentional? So some of the newest techniques and some of the research that I'm interested in is how linguists capture what they call pragmatics, or how they capture nuance. And some of the work that they do is in probabilistic inference. So I think that kind of right now, some of the richest research areas maybe are to find a way to marry both these data-driven approaches. How do you get better data out of these systems that Kevin is mentioning? And then how, for those who want to actually formalize and place more structure, how do you kind of marry the two?
That's fascinating, Meg. And then for our audience members who want to learn more about capturing information probabilistically and pragmatics, do you have any recommendations for some researchers that you happen to know about or recommend off the top of your head?
So off the top of my head, I think I will maybe introduce the kind of computational pragmatics notion. There's a lot of work in linguistics, and they're kind of both in cognitive and computational linguistics, and they're kind of using cognitive methods and cognitive framing to think about kind of linguistics from a computational perspective.
Fabulous, thank you. So Kevin, let me ask you this. We've talked a lot about the promise of AI increasing in the next 5 years. What are some of the technological limitations or roadblocks that you see are limiting the growth or appreciation of AI within law?
Well, Harry, I like to quote you. You wisely said once that machine learning yields intelligent results without intelligence. And I think we're seeing legal text analytics making predictions without being able to explain them in terms that lawyers can understand. And so the question is how to incorporate legal knowledge into the machine learning process, or at least use it to supplement machine learning in some way. We've seen some big advances in representing legal texts with transformer models like LegalBERT or GPT-3. LegalBERT in particular is trained on large corpora of legal texts, and this can enable it to take into account the context and the words in which the words appear in legal documents. But there are two big things that are still lacking. One is, as Marcus and Davis pointed out, deep learning just has information about lots and lots of complex correlations without any structure. And I can't figure out how the models are likely to be able to explain and argue about legal conclusions without taking conceptual structures into account. And then another wise person, David Ferrucci, the one who led the IBM team that developed Watson, likes to call these transformer models super parrots. Uh, they basically work by saying, to themselves, based on all the documents I've seen, what would a human likely say here? But his point is, there's a lot left unwritten. There's a vast body of shared experience that lead humans to write the words in the first place, and think of how true that is in legal practice. It's not written down. And if it's not written down, these super parrots are not going to be able to generate it.
Yeah, that's a great point. If I were to ask Legal Bert how many legs a banana has, it would probably give me a confident, nonsensical answer like GPT-3 did. Uh, Ansel, what are your thoughts on some of the roadblocks that are holding back AI?
Yeah, yeah. So building off what Kevin just mentioned about the corpora, I think the corpora themselves are perhaps an issue. When I was working on understanding contracts, there's not really a great corpus to go to. What everybody does is they scrape the SEC's Edgar database, which is big public companies filing their material contracts, if anything. Yeah. So it's super, super skewed to huge companies. And even within those huge companies, it's only the hugest contracts that get uploaded there. So that doesn't help a mom and pop business really at all. It's just the wrong corpus. So I just want to give a little plug for a place that does have a good corpus of legal documents. So I'm on the board of the Free Law Project, which is a nonprofit. And what we do there is we collect up as much primary legal material as we can and publish it for free. So that's all case law, but it's district court cases through the Recap browser extension. It's appellate cases, state, federal, as much as we can get our hands on. So great source for legal corpus if you're interested in case law.
Thank you, Ansel, and that's a great point. And I second the Free Law Project, and also the idea is a theme we've heard in some of the other panels, that part of what's holding back AI in law, particularly for public good purposes, is the lack of availability of data. We see sort of distorted data sets, like the Edgar data set, that are not representative of contracts as a whole. And we also see a lot of legal data protected by secrecy and privacy among firms. Kevin, do you have any reactions to Ansel's comments there?
Well, the availability of data is key. We've been using the Harvard CAPS resource, which is an amazing resource, and at least for purposes of research is readily available. In the area of automated contract reviewing, Nick pointed out that no single firm has enough data to learn the things that we would like to learn for purposes of issues like due diligence or risk assessment or things of that sort. And it raises the possibility of how that data could be shared across industry, which is maybe a pipe dream, but at least worth thinking about, I think, because it's key to making progress.
Absolutely. Megan, did you have thoughts on this area?
Yeah, I think my thoughts are less kind of technical, but more on sometimes the muddiness around who is the user for these products. I think a lot of the times we have these very social impact, kind of very access to justice perspective, but where kind of some of the uptake, it ends up turning into industry. And then there are hurdles around, are we going to allow those to take a look into our insurance contracts, for example, or whether or not we can actually, they're okay with sharing the clauses that have historically been problematic, for example. So I think less technical sometimes, but sometimes it might be a people problem and a direction of where actually is the problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of these are problems of practicality. So let me throw this out to anyone in the panel. Where do you see artificial intelligence adding the most value from a day-to-day perspective to actual attorneys in the 1 to your time frame compared to now, where we see developments sort of going. Kevin?
Well, I would focus again on that automated contract review area. I mean, one thing that I think is happening and increasing is that the tools are not just used for due diligence searches in mergers and acquisitions, but they're being institutionalized on a more regular basis into the functioning of a corporate legal department. And thus potentially putting in-house counsel in the position of monitoring the creation of new contracts and understanding the existing contract obligations. And I think that kind of putting the counsel, giving them more information, giving them the position of monitoring a greater area, and hopefully applying some intelligence here and there to apprise them of problems. I think that's likely to be the most useful thing that AI could do in the next 5 years.
So if I hear what you're saying is things like decision analytics for attorneys who have complex web of maybe even English language contracts, and the AI systems can help them understand in maybe probabilistic or broad strokes what they have in ways they can't quite understand now.
Yes, and perhaps help to identify conflicts and problems that would arise, that could arise. I realize that requires a lot, but we're speaking incrementally, right? And we've got 5 years and an increasing amount of data. I think that would be an interesting focus. But anyway, broadening the application of these sorts of tools beyond just preparation for litigation or preparation for mergers and acquisitions, and making it a more general part of corporate legal practice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it really comports with our idea of taking the technologies that are available today and just starting to apply them in ways that can be realistically done, but just aren't for whatever reason. Ansel, do you have any thoughts about that, given your own practice or experience in developing legal analytics?
Yeah. What I saw at the startup was really a lot of our potential customers were not ready to do really any kind of advanced analytics. And I sort of analogize it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If anybody's familiar with that, you've got physical needs, like you need to eat. You've got some other needs, like you need shelter above your head. And, eventually then you can start reading Shakespeare, but a lot of legal departments are not there yet, really at all. They're really still dealing with the physical needs of just like literally finding the contracts before you can analyze them. And just getting your house really in order at all. And having the right roles and responsibilities among people in your team. And, AI is only going to really help so much with that really basic stuff. That's really, but it is foundational, right? It's at the bottom of the pyramid because it is foundational, right? So I think there's a lot of work to be done just in terms of legal operations. So getting those houses in order so that we can move up there and eventually get to the point where there is some structured data, there is some organization, such that you can do the more interesting analytical work and really get to the top. I think I see that where I am as well. I have a dual role, so I do substantive legal work in trademark law, but I also do about a third of my time in the legal operations team, bringing in new technologies and rethinking how we do our work. And that's what I'm seeing.
Great, thanks, Ansel. And Megan, let me ask you the same question or react to either Kevin or Ansel's points.
Yeah, actually, so where I see quite a bit of exciting progress is probably in computable contracts. And you had mentioned this in one of your responses earlier. I think that what we notice sometimes with contracting is there is the happy path, for example, that kind of nothing happens and all is good. But when something happens, a lot of it is like, I really don't know, or I don't know what actually I don't know. And I think the point of computable contracts and having this type of structure is, while contracting, there's kind of this transparency and there's a clarity around what's going in right away, as opposed to kind of the retroactive approach, which is we're scrambling now and we have to unpack all this information at a later date. So, or kicking the can down the road, so to speak. So I think where things will be most powerful is in at least computable contracts, which I think works well with contract analytics eventually, or contract analytics provides information for how to build better computable contracts. So I think all of these things go hand in hand.
That's great, Megan. Thank you. So what I'm hearing a common theme among Ansel, Kevin, and you is that a lot of the work will be done in taking this implicit structure that exists out there in informal or formal paper documents and making them more explicit and formal and structured. And just that sort of infrastructure improvement will lead to more interesting, maybe more powerful analytics down the road. So that might be the next 5 years, is kind of this move to a little bit more explicitness in law. And one final question. Oh, Kevin, did you want to comment there?
No, I was just reading one of the chat questions, which looks interesting there.
Oh, yeah, we will get to that right away.
Okay.
But before we get to that, let me ask the final question. Then we'll turn to our first student question. Just on your wish list, what problem, if you could wave a magic wand, would you like to see the most solved in the next 1 to 5 year time frame? It could either be a technological problem in AI, something yet to be invented, or it could be a sociological or other problem out there. And I'll start with Ansel. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll get back on my Corpus Soapbox and ask all the corporate legal departments and small businesses out there to get together and contribute contracts to a corpus that we can use. That's one thing that kind of held us back.
Yeah, so that would be great. And, you know, a lot of AI has made progress in other areas outside of law because they have these giant corpuses like ImageNet, which are, you know, AI repositories of images and things like that. So we need some useful analogs in law. Megan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, if I had a magic wand, I think my goal is very much to what Kevin was saying right from the get-go, is that more people have access to legal information. I think access to justice comes from access to legal information. And I think right now what we see is that there's a moat around the legal language and the text, and kind of that is creating a fortress and protecting what people really need to access, not only these legal documents, whether it be case law or legislation or contracts. So for me, I think my hope is that the progress that we make with these types of technologies, that it's really able to reach everyone and that we raise the level of legal literacy across all.
Terrific. Thank you, Megan. And I think that echoes a lot of the themes we agree. Kevin, you've now been given the magic wand.
Okay, well, if I could, I'd wave it and enable deep learning neural networks to explain their predictions in terms that lawyers can understand. And I think for that, legal text analytics will have to extract aspects of legal knowledge from the legal texts and be able to turn them into explanations. And I think in doing that, we could make a connection to some of the knowledge-based work in AI and law, modeling reasoning by analogy in case arguments, for example, and use that to help with the machine learning generated predictions and explaining them to lawyers in terms that they will understand.
That's great. It's a really good point. So you don't want attorneys looking at 170 billion parameters and
No,
interpreting their weights?
that's correct.
Yeah.
And I don't want them accepting the predictions uncritically. And the systems need to be able to respond to what if variations on a question or problem scenario where the attorney is able to probe it in a way. And you can't do that, I don't think, without having it have more legal knowledge.
Great. Thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to the audience questions. So Kevin, I'm curious, which of the questions caught your fancy initially?
Have there been any strides towards developing a software that could potentially aid attorneys in predicting outcomes of court cases based on available data, in terms such as assisting an attorney in making a quick and efficient decision about whether the case is worth litigating?
Great. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Well, we've seen a lot of research in AI and law, in text, in predicting outcomes from the texts of cases. Of course, they're all previously decided cases, and you see the justifications in terms of sort of machine learning experiments and predictive accuracy based on a canned corpus of cases. What you don't see is these tools being brought out into the real world and dealing with sort of new cases, new problems that confront attorneys. We haven't seen any, I don't think we've seen any empirical research that involves actual users making some use of these predictive techniques. And I do think that's really necessary.
Great. Ansel, do you have any thoughts about this predictive analytics and outcomes?
I sure do, because that's what we were working on at Stanford when we met Harry. So that project was the IP litigation clearinghouse, where we went out and got all the patent cases, all the dockets from the 94 district courts, and a lot of the key documents, and analyzed them. And that spun out as Lex Machina, which was acquired by LexisNexis. And so they've been doing some of that for a long time now. I think in many ways that kind of analysis is fairly rudimentary. It can tell you a lot of useful stuff, like how long is your case likely to last now that you know which judge that you got within a district, or it can help you decide where you should file for the best likelihood of success in the shortest case, which translates often into the smallest bill, of course. So there's things like that. I agree, I think, with what Kevin was saying, that this is still fairly surface level. It doesn't get into the nuances of what the case is really about substantively, and do really reasoning on the basis of facts and arguments. And so I totally agree that that's a great area for expansion.
Great. Megan, do you have any thoughts about analytics, predictive analytics in the promise?
Yeah, so actually the question, what comes to mind immediately is BlueJay Legal, who they have a rather, and as Kevin had mentioned, it's contained, it's mostly to law firms or to companies. It's not for the general public, but they kind of look into predictive analytics from the narrow field of tax law, tax and employment. And so this is a form kind of this type of software that has been assisting attorneys in this kind of space. But again, it's not open and available to everyone at the moment, but that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree with everything that's been said. And one thing I'll mention again is that to the basic analytics that Ansel mentioned, just descriptive averages and things of that nature, research suggests that attorney decisions can actually be improved just by basic analytics, let alone the complex predictive neural networks. But there also is evidence that large companies like Walmart that have repeat types of cases, such as slip and fall cases, tens of thousands or employment litigation or building in-house systems that aim to predict. But like Kevin says, there's not a lot of public information about how good they actually are relative to informal attorney predictions. Let me turn to student Maddie, who has a question for the panelists. Thank you, Maddie.
Hi. Sorry, I've been having some technical difficulties. So you might have answered this already, but I have missed the majority of this because my Wi-Fi and my computer are not working. So sorry if this is a repeat question. But I guess it's for all of you. Where would you say that AI is currently the most successful in law, and where do you see that projecting to be the most successful in 5 years?
Ansel, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the most well-established use cases are probably e-discovery and due diligence review. There's really established companies like Kira Systems for the diligence stuff. It's kind of become the standard of care, if you will. You probably ought to use that stuff if you're doing a big enough deal. And similar in e-discovery, although I think there's probably more talk about it than there is actual work happening. Although it's definitely big. I mean, there's tons of vendors offering this stuff, and people save a lot of money and time using it. So again, at a certain level of litigation, it makes total sense to use these things.
And thanks, Ansel. And just for the law students out there who might not be sure of the terminology, roughly speaking, due diligence is when there's a merger or some sort of other business deal, looking through large amounts of documents to make sure that nothing surprising or untoward or that might scuttle the deal or mess up the valuation comes up. So it's sort of the attorneys just kicking the tires to make sure everything's okay. Kevin or Megan, do you have any thoughts?
I agree with Ansel's answer. The harder part of it is which will be most successful in 5 years. I'd like to think that some of the technologies that improve access to justice will be successful. I mentioned that we're working on a project that uses machine learning to identify sentences in cases that appear to be good explanations of statutory terms. And that is to say, they either provide a definition that isn't already in the statute, or a test, or examples or counterexamples. And we're using machine learning to identify the issue that the court was deciding when it provided that explanation and the conclusion it came to with respect to the issue. If we could do this, we're working with Cornell, LII, and the Canadian Legal Information Institute. It would be one way of providing some useful information for users, certainly for lawyers, but I think also for other non-legal types of users as well. Anyway, I think that kind of approach, summarization with users' purposes in mind, is an area that has a chance of succeeding soon.
So, Kevin, this is a great point. And James Hazard asked an earlier question. Why not make legal documents structured from the outset? So this is a lot of the work you're talking about is kind of implicitly and inferring things from data, kind of semi-structured data. Could you imagine, or would you like if you had a second magic wand, if there were court cases and there was a definition of the term, if the judge somehow formally bracketed this is a term and this is my definition in computer processable, unambiguous form? Well,
Harry, that I've been in AI law since the 80s, and that has been a perpetual goal of trying to get judges to speak in more structured terms, and I don't think it can succeed. But think of the context in like Cornell Legal Information Service, where they already have a dictionary, the WEX dictionary, where you can hit a link on a term and get a definition. Here, you could hit a link on a term and get not only a definition, but a sentence, an explanatory sentence from a case. That's a good explanation of a sentence. It's that kind of thing that I think could
Yeah,
work.
that's really so. And one example I'll say where the government, believe it or not, has produced structured data is the House of Representatives about 10 years ago took the U.S. Code, the titles of the U.S. Code, and released it in structured form with the imprimatur of the government on it. So I agree to you, it's not likely, but there's at least one example, so we can hope what you could imagine courts releasing decisions and then having some official court representative go through and annotate it in a way that receives the imprimatur of the court. Not likely, but at least possible.
Hope springs eternal.
Hope springs eternal. Megan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think that actually quite a bit of contracts and legislation is already rather structured. I think the stickiness is with with case law. And in part what Kevin was saying is that judges can be rather narrative in the way that they like to write. And a lot of it is storytelling, as opposed to maybe finding the facts or restating the facts. It's maybe crafting and constructing the facts that they want to kind of drive this narrative. And so one thing that might be interesting actually is whether there is a pattern in the way that these narratives form. And if there is a pattern, then we naturally can find this structure. So that might be an area of interest. But
Yeah,
it won't be in the next 5 years, I don't think.
That's a great point, Megan. So one really interesting question here is how do you see AI being used for reading long legislation? So I just had this experience. The infrastructure bill was passed, and I decided, unfortunately, to read it, and it is far too long for any human to comprehend. So, Kevin, do you see any prospects for summarization for either legislators or the public, things of that nature, in the next 5 years?
I have to say no, Harry. I don't. On the other hand, I don't have any. I don't have much experience at all with legislative texts. I was involved in a project with the School of Public Health where they had collected state statutes concerning public health emergencies. The statutes directed who in the public health system in the state was supposed to communicate with whom on what, over what time period, and so forth. And we did develop they developed a scheme for annotating those statutes, and we did some machine learning on it. And interestingly, what they would do is, having annotated it, they would create diagrams for a state with the participants in the public health system and linkages indicating who is directed to communicate with what other entity in it. And then you could superimpose the network for Texas over the network for Pennsylvania and learn interesting things from that comparison. That kind of graphic representation of what's in a statute might be something that could be feasible.
Megan, this is really up your alley, I feel like, given your work on linguistics and text. Do you have any thoughts about the capabilities for analyzing complex legislation that might be too hard to read?
Yeah, so I think there is quite a bit of research at the moment right now. Rules as Code is looking into how do you translate legislation, or how do you kind of work together in a paired programming almost sense. I know Catala, they do that with the French tax legislation. What's also interesting is sort of this other side that's, I think, spearheaded by Monica Palmirani on legal ML, and they're working on legislation and kind of how do you infuse more of that structure so that going forward, it'll be easier to kind of digest heavy, long legislative texts. But at the moment, I think it is still a bit sticky, troublesome to go through that many pages. And I feel like it speaks largely to the opacity of the language.
And just to follow up, Megan, would you advocate for a little more controlled or structured legislative language? Because there is a lot of structure. There's just not a lot of restrictions on conventions and things of that nature. Would that be Is that a promising outcome?
Yes, so I would, sorry, I would advocate more structure. I think on the condition that we figure out how to maintain some of the strategic silences. So what we notice, especially when it comes to legislative drafting, is that there isn't a lot of agreement, and it will take already far longer than what it already takes to kind of draft if we don't have the space for future negotiation and kind of that compromise. So I think structure, yes, more structure is great, but there are some things that natural language has done well, which is preserve sort of that flexibility and that elasticity. And some of those things are intentional. So I think we will have to figure out how do you do that and how do you kind of look into crafting with flexibility.
So more structure is not always desirable. In fact, it can lead to issues or problems. Ansel, do you have any thoughts about the legislation topic?
Just a few, yeah. This is something I learned at Airbus. There's an interesting thing called Simplified Technical English, and it's a controlled natural language, meaning it's a inventory of some number of words that you're allowed to use in an aircraft technical repair manual. And each of those words is defined with precisely one meaning. So it avoids certain kinds of ambiguity entirely. So that could be something to explore potentially for legislative drafting or contracts as well, which is the context I've been thinking about it.
Harry,
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Harry, you mentioned the word conventions, and I think there's some potential there. In that project I mentioned, we were amazed to see the lack of conventions on simple things like how to list items in a statute or relations between subsections or subparagraphs and so forth. If we could just adopt some conventions to standardize that, it might be very helpful.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ambiguity in statutes that's unintentional, right?
Yeah.
So we might be able to make pretty good progress by elevating that implicit formality and making it more explicit, even while preserving the areas for intentional ambiguity that allow flexibility. So we might, and that's to Ansel and Megan's point. Great point. And then we've got time for one more question. So Alec Walker says, many of these technologies being discussed already exist. The challenge from my experience is adoption. The legal sector is not looking for the solution, and typically instead of structures that within companies don't allow for such technologies to be explored or adopted. Do you see this changing? So attorneys don't want this, or maybe law firms have disincentives, but maybe corporate counsel, in-house counsel might have a different perspective. Ansel?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely. The incentives are very, very different. In-house, you are viewed as a cost center. You're not making money for the company, in contrast with the law firm where you as counsel are bringing in the money with your billable hours, right? And so in-house, we're always looking for efficiencies, and incentives are much better aligned. And so as a startup, I made the call that we were just not going to pursue law firms at all. If they came to us with a compelling use case, great, but we were not going to go chase them. So that's my perspective.
Kevin?
Well, it's an attitude that education might change eventually, Harry. For example, at Pitt Law, I teach a course on legal data analytics and AI, and we have a combination of law students and computer science or engineering graduate students, and involve them on working on projects. And I think that there is utility in getting law students to interact with technologists and to learn to explain to them what we know as lawyers, and to understand, or try to understand, what the engineering students are saying. And if we do that well enough, I think that once those people move into the legal practice area, that they'll want to make these sorts of connections, and they'll want to see what tools are possible. But it's a generational thing.
Agreed. And Megan, I'll give you the final word here.
It's quite a bit of pressure, but I definitely agree with Kevin from an educational perspective and echo the ideas that Ansel had put forward as well. This is, I think, something that will be heavily tackled from an educational perspective and possibly lowering legal literacy, not just at the law school level, but how do we tackle kind of youth and younger young adults that are kind of going through high school, perhaps. We see that law is something that seems to kind of be higher education, and that's where it goes. And we have a lot of disciplinary siloing, even as we grow up as kids. And so I think in part, being able to work with technologists, as Kevin was saying, at a younger age and being able to lower the overall, I guess, barrier around legal literacy and the age at which we're supposed to get acclimated with legal knowledge, I think will be helpful in terms of adoption and uptake on this type of technology.
Well, I want to thank Megan, Kevin, and Ansel for a really informative discussion and for the ability to peer into the near future. And more broadly, I want to thank all the panelists and the Silicon Flatirons faculty and staff for a terrific conference. I think it's been really informative. I certainly have learned a lot, so I'm grateful for everyone. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and we will see everybody hopefully in the future in person.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.